Hi, Stefano. How are you?
I'm doing well, Ozzy. How about yourself?
Good, good. I'm hosting for Mario today, so we're gonna have some fun talking about some of the news breaking today. Of course, there's Tulsi Gabbard's resignation. Um, you know, she she said that it's for her husband. He's going through bone cancer, and she wants to spend more time with him. But there's also a Reuters report that came out suggesting from some, informed, the saying sources that there was some sort of um, push for her to. It was a forced resignation, basically, from the administration. So um, I don't know what are your immediate reactions on that? Like, why do you think some people on the wall eventually, but others didn't?
Yeah. What I would say is, I think Tulsi Gabbard days were numbered, anyways, right? I mean, I think the straw that finally broke the camel's back was Joe Kent, the former National Counterterrorism Director, the National Counterterrorism Center Director, with his resignation letter related to the war in Iran and how he really kind of pushed this on Israel and saying how President Trump was like, manipulated or sucked into, or this undue influence that the Israelis control Trump, and that whole framing of Joe Kent really was a problem for the Trump administration. And Joe Kent comes from Tulsi Gabbard's camp, right? And it's kind of this very interesting aspect, right? During the Biden administration, I think this is kind of where we saw these different camps of America First, right? I think people think America First and MAGA is all just this one encompassing entity with this one political ideology. And obviously there's different blocks of that they all kind of compete internally. And Tulsi Gabbard, even though before America First and MAGA was a thing, she already had this very distinct political and foreign policy thinking when she was a congresswoman for Hawaii. And that very much famously was shown with her meeting with Bashar al-Assad, the former president of Syria, during the Syrian civil war, which really caught a lot of people off guard. Right? And so her focus has been much more, let's say, this Islamic terrorism. She wanted to focus much more on ISIS and al-Qaeda. We got to work with the Russians. We got to work with the Syrians. We should even work with the Iranians, because that's the primary number one threat. And Joe Kent, interestingly enough, although in 2020, after Soleimani was killed by President Trump in the first Trump administration, he kind of praised that, and he was very much against Iran in the beginning, kind of started to follow that same mold as Tulsi Gabbard. And, and in the end of the day, clearly Joe Kent came into this administration because of kind of this relationship and backing with Tulsi Gabbard. And so when he resigned and released that letter, and that pretty damning letter, there was reports that Tulsi Gabbard was going to get fired immediately. And it looks like Roger Stone personally intervened to stop that happen. And that's where Tulsi Gabbard has maybe some leeway also with Roger Stone. But even before that, I mean, I think there was a lot of things that Tulsi Gabbard did that really caused a lot of people to raise their eyebrows, and probably not well for the administration. And it's kind of funny, and I know this is something we'll probably talk about later, but I'm getting this sense within the administration and some of the reporting is there's only one person in this administration that can have the press over them and talk about them in the press and do crazy statements or do crazy things. And that's the president, Donald Trump. But everybody else is like, you're not here to take away the limelight from the president, right? You're here to follow. And I think, it'd be interesting to see if we get reporting from, let's say, the chief of staff, Susie Wiles, who is maybe trying to clamp down on some of these more, public facing figures within the administration that are probably undermining the president's administration.
Oh, she's always been the clamp down on everything. Do you remember last year she was like that? Even remember when Dan Caldwell left and he did an interview with Tucker Carlson about it, and it was a big deal in the administration. Sorry, you were going.
Yeah, no, and kind of what that kind of, I think that's kind of fitting this general mold, right? Where I think Tulsi Gabbard, because a lot of her interactions with the 2020 election, the Fulton County raid, where the FBI, like, why do you have the ODNI director involved in that? That's not, she's an intelligence person. I know, obviously, we all know CIA is under Title 50. I'm pretty certain the ODNI and many aspects also, I mean, obviously they have the FBI intelligence and all that, but they also have a lot of constraints within Title 50 specifically related to domestic matters, right? Like, that's why the ODNI is separate and not part of the Department of Justice or anything else, right? They don't have investigative powers in many aspects outside of the IG. And I think that a lot of that gets picked up by the media and has issues. And clearly, you were seeing Tulsi Gabbard's influence within the administration continue to be reduced, right? She was not part of the intimate circle of the capture for Nicolas Maduro. She was also reportedly kind of not really that much heavily involved in a lot of the operations related to Iran. She was kind of sidestepped in that. And clearly what you're seeing is John Ratcliffe, I think, within the intelligence community. John Ratcliffe is the one that is gaining an influence, but he's doing that behind the scenes, right? He's not very public. He's not very vocal, but he's being a very ineffective CIA director, at least within the construct of the Trump administration. And I think it clearly became a moment that I think Tulsi Gabbard really didn't know how to translate her position from her public-facing political ideology and thought process and to an effective, in the end of the day, political appointee of the president to run basically 17 intelligence agencies of the U.S. government. And I think that failure to do that and thinking that politics in and of itself was going to be enough clearly failed, that she lost a lot of favor within the administration. And I think it was a matter of time before she had to leave.
Sorry, I was trying to. Do you think? I asked this question a few minutes ago. Given what we're seeing in the in the war, and I've been talking about this now for I don't know months now. Like we've become regular around the war. Do you think this type of shakeup does anything to impact the way that the regime is going to look at this, the way that Iran looks at any leverage they have for negotiations? I'm curious your thoughts on this.
I wouldn't necessarily think that. I don't see. That's the thing. Tulsi Gabbard wasn't one of the main players in this, right? She really wasn't. I mean, even from an intelligence perspective in the decision making, there were some reports that she was kind of excluded in this. And even the problem is, I think, again, Tulsi Gabbard wasn't able to adapt to the new political reality, right? In the end of the day, there's one thing when you're a politician or a political public figure and you have your opinions, you talk about it, you run on it. There's a separate thing was when you get appointed into a position by the president. And at that point, you kind of have to, lockstep and do that. And I think that failure kind of had her pretty much excluded from a lot of the decision making. The people who are negotiating right now and leading the negotiations within Iran clearly is J.D. Vance, Jared Kushner, and Steve Witkoff. Keep an eye, though, on this, if I may. Marco Rubio already announced that they're kind of stopping the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, right? And he kind of said that, and the perfect people who were leading those negotiations was Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, right? And so now Marco Rubio is saying, no, we're done. Don't underestimate where, this is another thing that, these special envoys are being used, but where Marco Rubio as the Secretary of State might start trying to gain that influence and kind of remove them because of the failures of these envoys. And I think the negotiation, though, from Tulsi Gabbard's perspective is minimal. It's not that important. The Iranians might frame that as a win if they wish and so desire. I mean, the Iranians would claim anything as a win. But I wouldn't read too much into this in the negotiations. And obviously, we're in this very critical period where the Pakistanis are right now in Iran, the Qataris in Iran. Yeah. There's really a to get the negotiation. So we'll see if an end result occurs because of it.
Yeah, I mean, I asked because they do have this history of using disruptions in the United States as leverage too, in terms of playing some games with stall tactics over the pressure posture. I was just curious what your thoughts were on whether or not you thought they would play that. But seeing the last couple of days in the region with some of the assets moving around, I feel like every Thursday or Friday is, hey, war is about to start, or they could resume the strikes. We don't know. There's always, negotiation, there's deals, so-and-so is talking to so-and-so, and then, once the markets close on the Friday, we could expect something happening, and then nothing happens. What do you think, Stefano? Like, what do you take? What's your take on all of these assets moving around, where we are right now? You think something's going to happen by Monday or Tuesday?
I mean, look, if we're going to use the markets as a guideline and as a guidepost, obviously President Trump now has a long weekend, right? Instead of 2 days, he has 3 days, right? He has a 72-hour period, right? Once the market closed, which as of this record, well, live, we're in an hour away on Friday afternoon. If we're going to use that as a guidepost, and this is a pretty good weekend for the president to do it. Look, the amount of assets that the U.S. military already has in the Middle East as well is significant enough, right? I mean, with that, they can do the vast majority of whatever course of action the president might want to execute. They have the assets already in place. So there's not much more indicators and warnings or other assets that are required to deploy there for that to happen. So what I would say is we're just going to have to wait, right? We're going to have to see what happens with the negotiations. It's very interesting how the Pakistanis and and some of the Arabic media is trying to say a position where we're going to get a deal. But I would be very cautious because we've even seen Marco Rubio really walk those things back and really say, hey, we're not there yet. And it's almost like we're getting to a point where the media, specifically in the Middle East, an Arabic media, Arabia, really much so, is much more optimistic of a deal being reached than really anybody else. The Iranians don't seem optimistic. The Americans don't seem optimistic, but it's almost as if like the Pakistani and the Arabic media are the more optimistic ones of deal going through, but we just don't have that yet. And Marco Rubio put a lot of cold water, saying they're still very far apart. But we'll see. I mean, could a deal be reached? Absolutely. Could military operations resume quickly? Absolutely. It's just in the end of the day, there's very few people who can really answer that question. And right now, those are the decision makers to see if a deal or war resumes.
Yeah, I'm glad we're having this conversation. I asked you this question. Talked about some of this before. So Trump said several times this week, I would like to have the nuclear material, the nuclear dust. It's, it's okay if I don't get it. I'm paraphrasing. And then he said, it's just for public. About whether or not we're going to see the sneakers on the ground getting that. Iran has repeatedly said we can't access it because of the destruction that was done to the site in Isfahan. And then there's always this lingering, all options are on the table. As you said too, the GCC countries, several of them have come out. Even, Turkey, Erdogan has played a significant role in all of this throughout all this time. Do you see at some point with all of these deals, and we do see some boots on the ground, or we do see an escalation and another round of air campaigns, or as Hazem says, the slot machine lever goes down for another round of decapitation? Somehow this kind of just like freezing and going, just staying stagnant until people just forget about it.
It's very interesting. It's very funny you say that, because the last Mario interview I did, one of the things I said is like, look, don't discount the possibility that this current situation, this naval blockade and the closure of the Straits of Hormuz, might last a lot longer than people realize. I mean, one of the very interesting things from President Trump that he kind of said directly when asked about it, he said, I'm in no rush. And look, we can look at the domestic politics. We can see how this is affecting people. We can see the economy and all that. But in the end of the day, there is a possibility where the president might just say, I'm very comfortable with this naval blockade because of the cost it's putting more on the Iranians, right? The Iranians have a fuel shortage right now going on, impacting the country. Significant gasoline shortage, right? There is a lot of problems within the Iranian economy. Now, granted, this idea that necessarily translates to the regime is going to get overthrown is not, I wouldn't make that jump in that assumption that that's going to happen. So, but in the end of the day, from President Trump's perspective, he could be like, I'm more comfortable doing this and not putting risk in American forces. There was a True Social post yesterday where he shared an opinion piece from the New York Post, I believe it was, in which the author was arguing, just do Project Freedom, but 2.0, right? And just kind of do that and force the
I saw that.
Open, right? And then keep the naval blockade closed. That's another course of action, right? Where you and then what you do as the president, basically, you're kind of confining the war to that area within the Straits of Hormuz if the United States does forceful navigation measures, right? And then what you would probably see is Iran target Dubai, UAE, maybe Israel. But at that point, at least from the broader Middle East, they're saying, okay, well, we're not necessarily impacted by this. UAE will probably conduct military operations instead. But now there could be an argument that maybe if naval blockade only is not an option, you want Project Freedom 2.0, you're at least confining that conflict to a specific area around the Straits of Hormuz in UAE and Iran, right? And so that could be an option as well. The third option is what you said, which is, okay, decapitation strikes, another round of decapitation strikes, and maybe targeting some remaining military facilities and capabilities that the Iranians are trying to revamp since the end of the war. That's another one, right? At that point, then what you would cause, I think the problem would then become, if you do decapitation strikes, who was struck? Because that can have broad implications on the negotiation piece later down the road and how you want to end this war. Or is your goal just to cause the internal problem sets within the regime to continue to fracture and continue to spread? And then lastly, I think the last course of action is just like, the worst case in this sense would be not only broad-based strikes, but, strikes on energy facilities in Iran, the oil terminals, stuff like that, and even the possibility of ground troops getting involved in some specific operations, such as sieging Karg Island and other areas to reopen the Straits of Hormuz. That's also a thing. And so and I think that's where we're all looking at all the courses. Those are the kind of the four ones that I'm looking at. I think it's very interesting. Nobody's really talked about what we are right now, lasting a lot longer than most people realize. But I think all that is going to determine kind of the next steps. My main disagreement, though, that I have with people is this idea that President Trump is going to accept a bad deal and just walk away from this.
But what does a good deal look like, though, at this point, Stefano?
I mean, I think a good deal would be from, at least from a perspective. I think first of all, Iran has no ability to impose anything along the Straits of Hormuz. Like, it just goes back to before conflict. Then the question then becomes from the nuclear program. Honestly, I think President Trump says the nuclear material, like they have to remove it, etc. I think from President Trump's perspective, he would like all the enrichment to get out, all the nuclear material, all the nuclear enrichment materials to get out of Iran. And I've paused and to freeze on nuclear enrichment for a set duration of time. And then lastly, I think the other one from his perspective, all the underground facilities must be decommissioned. I think in that mind, because then he can say, okay, this is better than JCPOA. But if he kind of gets a JCPOA 2.0, but he's able to maintain the Straits of Hormuz open as before the war, I can easily see Trump saying that's a win for the U.S. Because then how he can frame it politically. Again, the question then becomes, I'm not saying I would believe it or you would believe it or the American people would believe it. That's not the argument I'm trying to make. I'm thinking what he can then say is, yeah, I got JCPOA. It's a 2.0, which is we look at the documents, man, this is basically the same as JCPOA. The Straits of Hormuz are completely open, free navigation, no tolls, no nothing. But then the way that he's going to flip this is say, look what I did with the Iranian military. Look at what I did with their economy. Look at what I did to their Navy. Look at what I did to the Air Force. Look at all
the supreme leader, even.
The supreme leader, the leadership. Look at everything I did. Mission accomplished, moving on. Then the only thing we would have to look into, right, is obviously the sanction reliefs or the return of assets. What's the quantity of that? But if I'm an Iranian, and I think a lot of people are going to look at the sanction release and the asset release, the assets that we have frozen is like a small percentage of the Iranian overall GDP, right? It's not going to make that much of a difference for the Iranian economy overall, et cetera. The key thing, though, is the sanctions, right? And that's where the conversations need to happen. Where are the sanctions and what they look like? But at the end of the day, I think even if President Trump gets a JCPOA 2.0 and the Straits of Hormuz open, I think he's then going to say, well, their military was decimated, so mission accomplished, and that's a win. And I don't think it's going to be a hard sell from his perspective to the American people. Not that you and I believe it, but that might be my answer to that.
Stefano, I do have a question. It's a fun one, but before I get to that, what are your thoughts on what's been going on with the UAE, though, in terms of leaving OPEC? And then, we thought it was going to be the start of the war. Remember, it was about, it started around a week and a half, 2 weeks ago now. Time flies. the back and forth, the strikes, Iran striking UAE, and then a lot of this activity. But then the story came out too. I don't know if you saw this a few days ago, so earlier in the week, that they had these deals selling oil since 2024. And they finally stopped it at some point in the last month, but it was still continuing. So I wonder, and right now I just see some back and forth between the GCC. There seems to be some other stuff going on. To me, it seems like nobody has an appetite for anything escalating anymore. It's done. Like the region is done. But then you see some signs of rhetoric in some places saying, no, hit them. It's fine. Let's get this started. We see all these, released reports by unconfirmed sources that the Saudis are really pushing the United States to continue with this and finish it. What is your take on all that? What's your read on that confusion?
What I would say is the problem is it's the inherent problem of relying to try to gauge the situation in the Middle East in rhetoric and perceptions on reports from the media. Not that the media is doing fake news, not that they're trying to manipulate or whatever. It's just that's not reality. Especially public diplomacy is rarely reality. It's just not. So based on the public reporting, what it looks like is, if you're looking at the GCC, Saudi Arabia and Qatar want to give negotiations a chance. And UAE wants to take a hardline approach in military operations to resume, right? That, if we're going to use at face value and all the reporting that we're trying to aggregate, that seems to be right now at least the consensus. Yeah. Israel obviously wants to continue this war. And so then the question is, where does President Trump and the U.S. land on this? It's hard to see if that's actually what's really going on. To be honest, it's really, really difficult. Obviously, one of the things that's very interesting.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time getting a read on it too. Yeah.
Right, but you're not going to. You're just not going to. And I think we just have to accept the matter that it's open to interpretation and manipulation. And that, again, even within the problem you're running into also, and as we see this in the U.S., I guarantee you, Ozzy, let's say you're a reporter. If you had two sources, if you had the ability to call Vice President J.D. Vance and you had the opportunity to call Secretary of State Marco Rubio and you ask them the same questions, they're both going to give you different answers. It's no different than in the Middle East, right? If you're talking to somebody within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or you're talking to somebody within the Ministry of Defense in Saudi Arabia, you're more than likely to get two separate answers, or somebody in the inner circle of Mohammed bin Salman, right? That's just the nature of it. Again, there is a very interesting take within the Arabic media right now, in the Gulf media, specifically Al Arabiya, which is very much pushing heavily on this idea that a deal is imminent. It's a very interesting development, and they seem to be the only ones that are reporting this. And then people on Twitter grab it and run with it. And it's also very interesting that the Iranians are very good at leveraging not only regional media, but Western media to push talking points to them, and that the Western media then publish for news articles, right? And then that kind of shapes a perception within the world media, but specifically within the West, that then drives the conversation of, for example, the Iranians have the upper hand, or the Iranians or the demands of the Iranians seems to be the agreement one, and then we have to wait on Marco Rubio, for example, to say no. That's not what we're negotiating. So clearly, I think there's a failure and a difficulty within the U.S. that they haven't been able to break that perception. But the Iranians specifically, I think, have been very successful since the start of this war of really setting the perceptions.
Have you had a chance to see on the Al Arabiya leak on the negotiation details?
Yes, I did.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? I'm pulling it up. I wanted to ask you. There were a couple on there that I saw. Which one was it? Okay. Commitments to respect sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-interference in internal affairs. That non-interference in internal affairs, how do you think Iran's going to react to that after what we saw since the protest?
I think that's one. What I would say is, I think that it would be very interesting from the Al Arabiya who's pushing this. let me take a step back though. Yesterday, again, you could dismiss it as Israeli misinformation or IO or etc. But there was a very interesting report, I believe, in Channel 14 that said that Pakistan was going to try to enable Iran to get into a deal more favorable to Iran with the U.S. under the idea that if sanction release happens, Iran then would help Pakistan with the fiscal problems that they have. Is that true? I don't know. I have no idea, right? We can speculate. We just have to use that as a post, right? But the reason why I say this is that even that case, and what you're saying now, is the whole problem what we're running into. And it's just this flooding of information that is very hard to determine what's really going on. Here's a key indicator, though. President Trump is not going to his son's wedding.
Yeah, I was going to mention, ask you about that. What do you think that, are we?
Look, I'm not going to get into the family business of Trump.
No. I'm not talking about the family business, but it just seems like another Friday where there are some serious signals that something could strike, and you and I are having a conversation about this. So I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't talk to you on a Friday, Stefano.
We're going to keep on going until the strikes actually happen, and then you and I are going to jump on a breaking news space, and then we're going to talk about it with a bunch of people to try to figure what's going on.
That's what I'm trying to. Yeah.
That's just how it is. That's how this works. And what I think how everything is getting framed, though, is that we're ignoring.
But I just don't see the strike starting. I mean, I see maybe down the road something happening, but I don't see it going the way that it. But it could. But it could. I mean,
all we know, the B2s are already on their way, and they're just waiting until 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to drop the first bomb. We don't know. You're not going to know. That's just the reality of the situation. Obviously, it's like, we got that Axios report from the middle of the week that we're going to give negotiation chance. Quote, Benjamin Netanyahu hair was on fire. He was pulling his hair. He was.
Oh God. Yeah. His hair is on fire. His hair is on fire.
Right. But it's funny because then if you look at reporting from before the war, there were similar stories leaked. From a similar, maybe not as that bad, but very similar to that.
You mean the trend that we're seeing and like the data points of communications?
And then the war just happened.
Yep.
But guess what? It's the same with Maduro. It did not look like January 3rd, 2026 was going to be the day that the U.S. was going to launch an operation that captured Nicolas Maduro. It didn't. And that's the problem. We're trying to rely on a very finite data source, even how expansive it is, which is the internet and reporting, to try to gauge, aggregate, and try to do that, but it's a source of information that is ripe for manipulation, ripe for disinformation, ripe for an ability to set the narrative, and to try to leverage that as an idea of trying to understand, are strikes happening or not, when there's only a very small group of people who know if this is going on and what's truly happening. And I think that's just the reality. And so does strikes happen now? Does it happen tomorrow? Does it happen next week? Right? President Trump, for example, when he gave negotiations a chance, he said, on Monday, he released it. I delayed strikes that were going to happen on Tuesday because these countries said the negotiations could continue. Is that true or is that bullshit? Then the Wall Street Journal came and said, well, a lot of Gulf officials weren't aware of these strikes. My question to the Wall Street Journal is, which Gulf, obviously they're not going to tell me, but who are those Gulf officials? Because I can tell you right now how the Middle East works. They also have their need to know. And it's a very small group of people. I would agree that in this time around, there's probably more people within the GCC that are being informed about any potential U.S. military strikes. Because now the element of surprise is done, right? They want to be informed because the U.S. wants to leverage them. And I wouldn't be surprised if the UAE even participates covertly, if not overtly, in these strikes against Iran. But again, it's just very difficult to figure out what's going on, and we just have to accept that. And we might run into a situation where if the war happens, you can look back and say, oh, it was pretty clear, or you can look back and say, oh, it was pretty shocking. But that's just hindsight's 2020.
Yeah. Okay, so for the fun question, you and I, we've discussed this before. You've asked this question before, actually, I should say, even from many people, is, what does the internal political landscape look like? What's going on between these political groups, between the officials and all of that? The other day, the New York Times came out with an article. Did you see that one about Ahmadinejad?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious your thoughts on that. If you remember, we were in a space that we were discussing the day that the Ahmadinejad's house was struck. Remember?
Mhm.
And everybody thought that he was killed. And then there were several sources on X. I think Patrick Bet-David came out and said too that his team reached out to Patrick Bet-David's team and said that he's alive and he's safe. Stay tuned. That was March 2nd. This article came out and it sort of tracks some things, but then it also seems really, really crazy. What are your thoughts on this article and what it says?
I mean, I've heard both sides. I've also heard people like blast it and say that it was an attempt, that it was information that was leaked, that it wasn't correct, but it was an attempt to cause paranoia within Iran to skyrocket and cause internal division to coincide. Actually, look, we're not going to know. An operation like that, by the way, let's say if it's true, when it happened, a very small circle of people will know about it. That is those types of operations.
Yeah, that's the general consensus as well.
Very small group of people would know about it. And so, if it's true, there's a lot of missing data in that report to indicate one way or another. If that report was true, then how would that work? What I do believe, though, is regardless if it's true or not, even if it is true, it is causing paranoia to increase within Iran. And I think the argument that right now is kind of dominating this conversation, a lot of it is that there's this idea that Iran is operating in a one single faction. And if you've seen me to this day, I heavily disagree with that assumption. I heavily disagree with this idea that Iran is acting from a political entity as a single focus, right? It's not. I think the death of Ali Khamenei, the assassination of Ali Khamenei by Israel on the start of this war, caused significant problems within the regime and the fracturing of the regime. And the power structure inside of Iran has forever been fractured. And it's still fractured to this day. If there were areas of stability and ability to continue, we would see different aspects of Iran operate. Number one, for example, is why is Iran's internet blackout still going on?
Well, you heard what they started doing. They rolled out a program on the internet. So this is interesting, though, because it makes me think back to this Al Arabiya report that came out with those terms of the negotiation. Iran started this new internet access program where you have to give your ID, you have to do a whole bunch of things and sign an attestation promising that you would not use your access to internet for, I'll just call it all nefarious reasons, but, organizing, talking to outside intelligence organizations, things like that. Like under this national security, which kind of aligns and tracks with influence campaigns. So that was interesting to me with the internet blackout, that they're opening it back up again, but you have to sign something saying that you're not going to communicate with anyone. You're not going to advocate for protests that goes against the national security with that. So I don't know. Sorry. You were saying that
Sorry, okay. I was muted. I think that, the internet, I think is a big, but it goes back to this conversation that I had that I think the Iranian regime is very fractured, right? We have our own data sets that run through things and kind of pass information, right, in our own AI, et cetera. And one of the things is we're not talking about, one, the amount of detention that Iran has been doing. Number two, the amount of property confiscation that they have done and the amount of executions. And then even within the Iranian media landscape, how there's there's knives pointed at the West and the US and Israel, specifically in Dubai, but also at each other. And then the reporting of who's really in charge and who's doing what? Was Ghalibaf the lead negotiator, then removed as the lead negotiator, and then put back as a lead negotiator?
Yeah, he's a lead negotiator now.
Right, but it's okay, wait a minute. That is causing problems. That is a specific aspect that goes to the heart of my argument. And look, you might not agree with what this administration is saying, but they've kind of been saying this repeatedly, that there are problems within the Islamic Republic and within the regime, that they don't cross communicate between each other. Now they're making this as an argument why negotiations are harder to be done. Is the IRGC more, and even within the IRGC, there seems to be fracturing. And I think that's why it goes back all the way back to my earlier aspect where the people are saying, well, the president's going to take a bad deal to walk away from this. And I'm like, he could have already. If he wanted to, he could have, but he hasn't. And so that's why I'm saying I don't believe that. It's not that I believe, I'm not trying to make a political argument. I'm not trying to say Trump is the best or the worst president in history. That's irrelevant to this. It's, if he wanted to take a bad deal, there are already bad deals there that he could have taken and walked away, but he hasn't. The military force is still very, you have to look at the other data. We haven't seen them do that. The military force posture is extremely high in the Middle East. And if anything, there are indications that I'm leaning towards more the ability that there might be military strikes resuming than a bad deal. If you're going to ask me what I think is more likely, I think military strikes resuming is a more likely outcome than him taking a bad deal and walking away.
You think so?
Yeah. Yes.
But do you think that resuming the strikes are going to lead to a better deal?
We got to see how the strikes and what they do.
Yeah.
Right. It's and we don't know how that, like, for example, I don't know. Let's say they conduct strikes against oil facilities in Iran. So then Iran retaliates and strikes oil facilities within the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and UAE. So then Saudi Arabia might say, okay, well, we have to get involved. And now they're going to do military strikes. And so now you're having a completely different ballgame situation, how it's done. What I would say that I think the Iranians need to realize, and I think the irony is, I think the president of Iran acknowledges this. He might be one of the few people in Iran to acknowledge this, is like, we have no economy right now. Like, he's kind of said this in multiple aspects. Like, one of the ways he's framing right now for the Iranian people, because I don't think he has a choice, is he basically has to frame as we're in a war economy, right? We're in a war footing, so we have to go into a war economy. There's barely any manufacturing. There's barely any consumption. The internet is shut down. At least 1 million jobs have directly been lost because of the wars, with 1 million other indirectly lost because of this war. And the president's saying, we don't have this. And so and I think he's one of the few people who's trying to highlight, we need a solution quickly because this isn't a long-term solution. And what President Trump is saying in his rhetoric, which is very, so if you're going to compare presidents to president, the Iranian president messaging has been very much on that idea. The American president, he's been dismissive of the American people suffering because of this, which is going to be terrible for the midterms. But his argument and what he's been pressing is that the economic pain suffered on the Americans pales in comparison to what's going on with the Iranians. And so that maybe the Americans are more, he doesn't see it as a significant problem because there's other ways that we can mitigate it. And we can say that's crazy talk from a domestic political perspective, absolutely. But if you're going to look at the aggregate and the full picture of Iran's economy and the U.S. economy, I mean, it's pretty hard to make an argument that the Americans are doing worse. We're not doing worse than the Iranians. Clearly, it's the Iranians, right? So that's where you have to kind of look up objectively. And I think Trump is using that as an excuse to say, I have no rush.
No, I mean, I see that. I still think it's going to end up frozen or just stale.
I would not disagree. I would not disagree with that.
It's just going to kind of stay stale, and we're just in 6 months we're going to have the same conversation and say, okay, is it this weekend or not? Because it's just it's going to be a back and forth. I don't know, but I guess that remains to be seen. Stefano, thank you for this. It was fun actually to see you and have this conversation. I'm sure a lot of other news is going to come out over the weekend. Yeah. So we'll have more opportunities to talk about that. In the meantime, I hope you have a great evening.
I want to thank you. It was great to do this finally in person on camera.
I know.
If something crazy happens over the weekend, you and I will jump on a space for everybody to listen in and guide the conversation. But Ozzy, thank you for hosting this. You did great, and great to see you, and happy Memorial Day weekend.
Thank you. Same to you, Stefano.
Bye.
Bye.